remember the cries for freedom, the cries for justice. I saw what injustices happen in low income communities. I made it through the crack epidemic here in New York City, which hit low income, predominantly African American and Hispanic communities. I lived
Yeah.
in these communities with the knowledge that there are injustices that happen, there are unfair things, there are places that need to be revitalized and reimagined. How do we do that without creating other forms of oppression? How do we do
Yeah.
that without creating more divisiveness?
Jessica Janniere, what is going on, my friend?
Hey Shae, how are you?
I'm doing great. I've been looking forward to our chat. Just some background for those who are watching and listening. I had reached out on Facebook and said, and on LinkedIn, and was like, I want to have some conversations with some folks around diversity, equity, inclusion, a kingdom lens in the midst of all the things going on in culture. And your name, among a handful of others, came up. And so we've had some time to chat a little bit, but I get to just hang out with you and explore your story a bit more and all the goodness of what you've been experiencing. So thank you for joining me, Jessica.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited about our time together today.
Absolutely. Okay, so let's start here because you have a really unique background. Take us back and tell us a bit about your family and personal story.
Yeah, it's been an interesting journey to say the least. So, my life actually began in Germany. And during the time my mom was pregnant with me, and I think this is very relevant because I really believe it highlights the grace of God and how He has a purpose for each and every one of us. When she was pregnant with me, she was actually homeless at the time, coming out of a very abusive marriage. She was looking for an abortion, and she could not find a doctor in the German town that would perform the abortion. They told her
Wow.
that she would need to travel to Holland. Now, she didn't have the means to travel to Holland, so she was forced to give birth to me. At that
Wow.
time, she brought me to my grandparents' home, which was on a farm in a very small town called Tiefenbach. And I lived there with them for the first 6 years of my life. I did not really remember seeing my mom during those years. The greatest memory I have of her was when it was time to leave Germany. So by this time, my mom had remarried. She had other children. She had married an African American soldier that was stationed in Germany. And during this time, this was like the early 80s now, where I had no concept of race and culture and
Right.
anything to do with America. But looking back now, I understood that that small town had a residue of the neo-Nazi culture. So they were very disturbed by the
Right.
fact that they had an interracial couple in this small town with mixed
Yes.
children. My two siblings, my sister Vicky and my brother Tyrone were born in Germany as well. And my sister Vicky was very dark skinned, very dark skinned. She had the typical black girl hair.
Yep.
So they really stood out. And they basically
And
were,
his name, wait, your brother's name was Tyrone. I
yes.
mean,
So they literally stood out. So here, I have this new family that my mom was like, "You're coming to America with us." So now I'm in this new family, where I'm the oldest sibling. I'm the only white kid. I don't speak the language, and we
wow.
moved from this German area to now Queens, New York. And it was this area was very significant because it was an area called Rosedale, Queens. Now, in the 80s, Rosedale, Queens was going through what they call the white flight. Now, I had no knowledge of this. Now I'm about
Right.
7 years old, moving into this culture. I'm living with my step grandparents who were Black Southerners. They were Baptists, they were members of a church. They were very well respected from what I've known, what I've gathered through the years. However, they were very problematic because they were very angry that their son married a white woman, and we
Ah.
had to live with them. So you can only imagine what that was like.
A little tense at
Oh, just a
times.
little tense,
A little bit.
yes. Just a little bit. It was so tense that they actually used to hide me in the back room. I was not allowed to go outside. Only
What?
time I was allowed to go outside was when I went to school. Now you have to imagine a little white German girl coming into American, not just American culture, but American black culture. So now
Yeah.
I'm in a school where 99.9 of the students were African American. They were black.
Wow.
And because I didn't know the language, I was moved into this single room where now is getting ESL classes,
Yep.
English as a second language.
Yes.
What that did for me was it made me stand out even more because now I'm the only white kid in the school. I'm in this classroom by myself, like I'm a weirdo. And every day after school, I kid you not, there were dozens of kids chasing me to jump me,
Wow.
to beat me up. I remember I literally have memories of mobs of kids chasing me through the park and me trying to make it home to the house so that I wouldn't get beat up.
Wow. How old were you
About
around
7
this
years
time?
old at the time.
Oh my goodness. This
Yes,
is very early elementary school.
very early elementary school. Now, I also want to just put into context, like what with the parental issue. So, my stepfather was an alcoholic, very militant man, very stoic, very abusive man. My mother was a German woman who left Germany. She wasn't very educated, so she was dependent on him on a lot of. She was dependent on him for a lot of things.
Sure.
And that began to make sense to me as I got older. I'm like, okay, why would she stay with this man? Like, what's going on here? Why would she allow him to be so abusive to me? Why are we even living in this home where it was just, it wasn't even tense or toxic, it was abusive. Like, my step
Right.
grandparents were physically abusive towards me. And one of my I guess strongest memories of living in the house was not just being hidden in the back room, but also having to go downstairs and get a switch.
Mhm.
Now, people culturally may not know what a switch is, but if you're from a black family, a switch is something that's very normal. Like you mess up, you show disrespect, you don't do something that you're told to do, um, the switch will become your friend very
Yeah.
quickly. So my step grandmother would send me downstairs to get a switch for whatever I had quote unquote done wrong. And I remember she had a set of stairs. It had to be like 12 to 15 stairs because they lived on the second floor of this house. The landlord lived downstairs. And I remember walking up and down those steps at least 3 or 4 times, getting a new switch because she would take the switch, she would go like this on her hand to feel the
Yes.
thickness of it. And she'd
Yep.
go, no, go back down and get another
Go
switch.
get another one.
And by the third or fourth time, she would get so angry that she would go down and get one that she felt was appropriate. And then she would beat me with the switch.
Were you the only child of all the children there that would get beat with a switch?
Yes. So I was the only child that got hit physically. Because I was also the oldest child, it brought in the dynamic of I was responsible for the other kids.
Right.
So if they
Right.
started fighting, I would get hit. If they didn't, like, if something happened between them, why aren't you watching them? So it also created this strange dysfunctional dynamic as an older sibling between me
Yeah.
and my siblings.
Did you have a sense? Because I remember, being that age, and I grew up on the other side. We would be the only black family in white communities or in white churches, etc. And at that age, I had no awareness. The whole idea of different skin color, all of those things didn't even really resonate with me. I had friends, all those things. With all the dynamics of what was going on with you, especially being in a household where you have siblings that are darker skinned, you kind of came into this new family, and then you're experiencing this different treatment from being the oldest child and the one who doesn't know the language and the one with white skin in the family. Did you have a awareness that that was the core difference, like that this was a race connected thing? Did you make those connections as a kid, or were you just like, I just don't like it here, and I don't, why am I being treated this way? Did you
Yeah,
make
no,
those
that's a
connections?
great question. I think it became very clear to me once I saw that no one looked like me. where everywhere I went. So like in the
Mm,
neighborhood, um, just going everywhere. And I'm literally, my mom and I were the only white people in so many of these spaces and places for so long. But at that age, it 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 was confusing, and I didn't fully gather what was happening, but I knew something about race was there because I was called a lot of names. Like my grandmother, she would literally call me the hunky word, like as she would hit
mm,
me. And she would
right.
tell me, like, you take your little white behind, like, I'm speaking very PG, but,
Right.
she would say, like, get your little white ass in the room and
Right.
you stay in there. And so
Yep.
I was getting called white names or I was made
Got it.
fun of. So then it was
Yes.
like, okay, wow, this is a problem.
Yeah. But at the same time, you had a good relationship with your siblings, it sounds
I
like.
did. So I was always like the nurturer. I always looked out for them because we didn't live with my step grandparents very long. I think we were with them for about a year. When we moved into another part of Queens, we moved into an all Caribbean neighborhood. I mean, predominantly Caribbean neighborhood. This is where we met people who were Haitian, who were Jamaican,
Jamaican.
Trinidadian. That school, when I went to that school, you had some maybe light skinned Puerto Ricans or Hispanic people,
Yep.
that went to that school. But that immediate neighborhood and even our landlords that lived in the house where we lived, they were West Indian, they were Caribbean.
And that was a whole nother layer
That's
of
a whole
culture.
nother layer of culture.
Yes.
Yes. So
Yes.
it's very, very fascinating. But the first family that befriended me in that community was a Jamaican family. So now I used to go over to the house and I'm hearing the tunes of Bob Marley. I'm getting exposed to ackee and saltfish and all the different
Oh,
Caribbean
yeah.
dishes. And like, this is now part of my everyday norm.
Yes. Yes. And now, as far as faith background, so where's your family church attending? I know there's church attendance and there's Christ following. So like, what was kind of the faith dynamic as a young person?
Yeah, so the faith dynamic was very confusing because my first introduction to anything related to Jesus was through my step grandparents who,
Oh,
right. So I would see them getting dressed for church on Sundays. They never took me to their church. I don't have any memory of ever going to their church. I do remember my step grandmother being dressed very nicely. She would always wear the church hats, like the Black Southern women who would
yep.
wear those church hats. Always looked very together. They would play gospel music in the house, and it created a conflict for me because the word Jesus became a trigger word for me,
Right.
and I didn't understand what was happening until much later. But I didn't really want anything to do with the word Jesus or this concept or
Yep.
idea of Jesus. Now, when we moved into the other part of Queens and it was just my stepfather, my mom, and my siblings and I, we really didn't go to church. There was no talk about God. I know that through the years, my mother did take us to like Catholic Mass, maybe Christmas time. Then that was confusing too because it's like, okay, you drink some wine, you get a piece of bread,
Yep.
and it just felt very disconnected for me. So the whole idea of God being there became very confusing and at some
Yeah.
point very angering for me.
Yeah. When did that change?
It changed in my young adult life. I think when it really started to change was when I was a teenager. I had gone through this period where, through my teen years, and I also have to say, just for context, once we left Germany, I had no connection with my family in Germany.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So it wasn't like we were keeping in touch and I was connected to my culture there. I was totally disconnected from my German culture. I didn't even remember some of my family members there. I lost the language over a period of time. I found out that my documents were hidden. My stepfather had hidden and basically stolen our documents. So we didn't have a phone for many years. Like we were just totally disconnected.
Wow.
So now I'm going through this period where I don't know anything about my German culture. I'm now in America. I'm in Black culture. Now I'm exposed to Caribbean culture and all these different
Right.
cultures. And I went through a period where I really didn't know who I was.
Sure.
And then you add the faith component, right? It's like, okay, God, and then you add the layer of dysfunction with abuse, domestic violence happening in the home. That went on for 16 years. The physical abuse that I experienced from my mom and my stepfather, because I didn't know at the time, but my mom was bipolar. So
Oh,
it
wow.
explained a lot of her erratic behaviors through the years
Yes.
and why she was so neglectful, why she maybe made some of the choices that she did. So there was a lot a lot of odds
There's a
against
lot in
me.
there.
There's a lot in there. And then you add the poverty component. Like my mother didn't work because she didn't have an American education. So she
Right.
would clean houses for maybe some of the Jews in the area, maybe get like off the books jobs. My stepfather again was an alcoholic. So when he worked, when Friday came around and that was payday, he would disappear for the weekend. So
Mm.
my mother depended on welfare and the system to raise five children. There were five of us.
Wow. Wow.
So you add that component to all of the other layers because
Yes.
poverty in and of itself is very traumatizing.
Absolutely.
And then you have these other
Absolutely.
elements. Yeah. So God to me was like, okay, does God exist? I don't really believe God exists because if he does, why would he let these things
Right.
happen?
Right. Right. But then you said that that changed in your early adulthood. Was this pre-marriage, prior to marriage? I don't know when you got married, but tell me a little bit
Yeah.
about that.
I feel like it really happened over a period of time. Even like when I say my coming to Jesus moment, right? I remember it happening in dots, like in different spots. And I believe that it happened that way because there were so many layers of trauma
Right.
that I experienced over time that I really believe God just kept meeting me in these different moments of my life to
Yeah.
say, I am here and I've
Yes.
been with you. And there is purpose in your pain. And this is all going to make sense one day. And there's like
Wow.
these different moments. I think one of the most, I guess, eye opening moments was around the age of 17. And I had just attempted suicide for the third
Mm.
time in 3 years.
Wow.
So I am a three-time suicide attempt survivor, and it was during a very difficult time. It was during the height of my teen years. My mother and stepfather had split up finally after 16 years, and the abuse continued from a distance. And during that time, I began to rely heavily on drinking, taking drugs, and just getting involved in things that I thought would kind of help me cope with some of this pain. Well,
Sure.
after my third attempt and waking up, I was like, something is, there's got to be something. Like,
Right.
okay,
Like
God,
this can't be it.
like this can't be it. Like, okay, God, I like it really raised my curiosity. And I started to think, well, maybe God is real and maybe God does not want me to die in this. Maybe there's something better ahead. And I feel like it became a spark of hope for me. My sister who was 3 years apart from me, she was the first of the siblings born to my stepfather and my mom. She
Mhm.
unfortunately passed away a year later due to gang violence because again
Yeah.
we come from a very dysfunctional family. um, and when she passed away, that was when the light went off in me and I said,
Yeah.
I can't continue going down this track. And the fact that she had to lose her life and became a victim of the circumstances, I need to rise up and honor her life and do something with myself. And so that
Wow.
became my inspiration to really seek healing, to seek a sense of purpose. I can't say that I was walking with God, but
Sure.
I do feel like he was with me. And it was in a strange way. I believed in a higher power at that time.
Right.
And that's when I
And the
really,
awareness of him,
right.
his involvement in your life.
It is. And it was so interesting because during this time was when I called myself a searcher. So I had Dalai Lama books. I had, the Quran at the house. Like I was looking at all of these different pieces of religious, um, messaging. And I said, well, God, which one is you? Where are you in all of this? I was
Yeah.
into, the angels and the psychics. And like I was dabbling in a little bit of everything. And I realized
Yes.
now looking back, it's because I am a spiritual person, and my spirit craves to worship and know God and to praise God.
Yes.
And so in my search, I was looking in all of these places, but when I finally came to the knowledge of Christ some years later, I was at that point immediately where you couldn't tell me anything.
You're sold out.
I'm like, I'm sold out. I've seen everything else. I've dabbled in everything else. I've experienced this, and I see the difference. I feel the
Yeah.
difference. I know the difference.
Yeah, that's good. Share with me, because before we kind of shift into even some of the work you're doing and some of the things that God's shown you through that, talk about your family dynamic, your marriage and kids.
I was around 23 years old when I got married, 23 years old. I met my husband at work, and I was a young mom at the time. I was a single mom. My daughter was already in the picture from a previous relationship. This year, we celebrated our 21st wedding anniversary
Oh, that's
by
awesome.
the grace of God. And he has always taken my daughter as his own child, even though her biological dad was always in the picture and we co
Yeah.
parented. And he's a great guy as well. But my husband has always referred to my daughter as his daughter, and vice versa. So it's been beautiful. And so we've raised all three of our children. We had three children in total, and my family is just, to me, a sign of God's miraculous work, because
Yeah.
for me, my greatest accomplishment is my family. It's looking at my family and saying, okay, we're not perfect. We have the residue of a lot of trauma that's been passed down that we're working through. However, we have love at the center, and
Yes.
breaking that cycle of child abuse and breaking that cycle of dysfunction um, is just miraculous. And it's truly
Yeah.
God's grace, truly.
If I remember correctly, I mean, we only spoke briefly once before, but there's a mixed race dynamic with you and your husband. Is that correct?
Yes. So my husband is actually Panamanian American. Both of his
Panamanian.
parents are from Panama. His dad is Panamanian and Jamaican. His mom is Panamanian. So my husband, and it was very interesting because when I met my husband, he had never dated outside of his race before. Whereas for me, I'd never dated anyone of my race because I didn't,
Right.
right, because I didn't know anybody. Like
Right.
growing up where I grew up, there were no white people. There just weren't. And so it demographically speaking, it made sense that I would date who's available, in my
Yes.
environment. But he had never dated outside of his race. And I remember saying to him, like, are you sure you want to do this? Like, you sure? And he kept saying to me, he said, Jessica, when I'm with you, he goes, this was back in like 2000 or 19, yeah, about 2000. Well, no, 2001 or so. And he said to me, he's like, he goes, can I be real with you? I feel like I'm with a black woman when I'm with you. And he said that to me because culturally speaking, everything that he had grown up around, I had grown up around as well.
That's
So
right.
like our first couple of dates, we were going to get oxtails and Jamaican
Yep.
colas, and like it wasn't anything new to me. It was normal. And just growing up, like he grew up in some of the rough areas of Brooklyn. I had grown up in the rough areas of, Queens. And so the culture that we grew up in negated the color of our skin. The
That's right.
cultural experiences really, really brought us together because, like,
Yeah.
you know, And so hopefully no one gets offended by that comment, because I know with
Th-
race,
there was
like,
nothing offensive in anything that you
right,
just said.
because people are just like, what do you mean? He felt like you were a black woman. Well, because black women tend to have these type of cultural experiences. It's not something that white women tend to have, but it was something
Right.
that not only was I exposed to, but I was raised in. It was something that
Yes, that
became
was like your legitimate life. It wasn't you trying to figure
exactly
out. Right. It
right.
was your life. That
It
was
was
your everyday.
It was my everyday. And to me, it was
Yeah.
normal. And it wasn't
Yes.
abnormal until I went out into society and I interacted with other white people that I realized, this ain't so normal.
You don't need
You
oxtail?
right.
What?
You don't know who Barris Hammond is, and you don't know this, and like, oh my goodness. You've never heard of
That
Jerry
is
Curl
hilarious.
Activator? Because I used to go to the black hair store to get Jerry
Right.
Curl Activator for my stepfather when I was younger. So I was exposed to black hair products for years. And so it wasn't anything abnormal to me. It's like this is
Right.
this is life. This is what it is.
Yes. Oh my
So
gosh. So there's so much now that I understand about how you landed where you landed in terms of the work that you do and the focus that you have within it. So let's shift gears a little bit and share with everyone, just kind of give a summary of the type of work that you're doing. And then I want to explore some of these things that you've experienced, and I've experienced, where the Lord's giving you a kingdom perspective in the midst of all these kind of cultural dynamics and even political dynamics and all these things that have shown up, uh, just kind of at the integration of race and culture and politics and stuff like that.
mhm.
So share a little bit about what you're doing business wise now.
Yeah, so I run an organization called Look Up and Beyond. And Look Up and Beyond is an award winning personal development company that really focuses on equipping and inspiring people to overcome the pain of their past, to live purpose driven, and fulfilling lives. And I do this through speaking, keynotes, training, and facilitation. I do this through coaching programs, and it's something that has really, really evolved into a lot of leadership development.
Right.
So that's how I ended up now. When I initially started, I really was just an author and what you would call a quote unquote motivational speaker. Now I
Right.
don't identify in any way as a motivational speaker. Like, I see myself as someone who really provides transformational services that really
Yeah.
gets to matters of the heart, that takes a trauma informed approach when necessary, that really helps us to reframe the negative circumstances of our lives to propel us to a purpose. And
Yeah.
God has a purpose for each of us. And so I'm very blessed and fortunate to work with very, very diverse audiences and groups of people. As I travel across the country, I mean, I've worked in the youth sector. That's where I actually started. And I'm still mentoring young people today. And I've worked with professional C suite level executives and anywhere in between. And it's just an honor. And I genuinely just love people, and I love seeing people thrive beyond what they thought they could. it,
Yes.
it really just excites me. And to know that, I have a story that I can thread into my work, because it's one thing to read something from a book, it's another thing to live it.
Yes. Yes, that's it. If I recall, you have a focus. There's been a lot from a service perspective in the educational sector, and I think we had a conversation. You were talked about kind of like workforce. So from a leadership, like workforce development and leadership, has that been mostly in the context of education, school system, or those types of things?
Yeah, so I would say in recent years, most of my audience and the work that I've done has been in
Hmm.
workforce development and in the education market.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So the year, I mean, I could go back before 2020 and say like 2016, because there's a lot of kind of dynamics going on in the United States. Kind of the rise of Black Lives Matter movement, and there were some things that were just like in the news, and there was kind of like there's some energy around that. I would say 2016, etc. Then in 2020, in the midst of COVID pandemic, We had that going on. We had election season. We had George Floyd. The whole watching the video of George Floyd and a knee on his neck, and then he dies, and then an uproar of all kinds of dynamics going on all summer of 2020 and all those things, which then led to a lot of organizations and companies starting to like think about, okay, we got a lot of folks that want us to do things. Some folks would just, I'm going to pick on Black Lives Matter for a second. There would be, oh, we'll put up a black square. Some are just like, we're gonna do some things that try to show our support. We'll put a black square, we'll do these things. Others were like, man, we got to figure some stuff out because there's some dynamics going on in our company that we need to kind of pay attention to, or those types of things. And others were like, I don't know what to do. Like, to think about executives that are like, I don't know what to do in this wild space of time that we're in right now. And I'm curious to know, in your work, because I think it's interesting, your kingdom perspective, your kingdom lens in the midst of these kinds of conversations, in the context of your work, you've looked at this like, we'll be trauma informed where we need to, we're going to be love centered, love based, and we're not going to overly focus on these particular matters, but yet we could still bring healing to these matters and these divisions. Like, talk about what that's looked like for you in working with clients, or from the leadership perspective and education. What have you been experiencing? I would say specifically 2020 and beyond in this space.
Sure. Yeah, well, I think it's important to be um, sensitive and to be mindful that we live in a very sensitive time. And we live in a
Yeah,
time where many people have experienced great trauma. The
that's right.
pandemic alone was very traumatic for people.
X.
Um, for some people, they still feel it was a farce. They don't think that it ever happened. God bless those people, that God covered them and they didn't have to experience some of those things. I live in a community where I saw firsthand the impacts of the pandemic.
Yeah.
My church at the time lost over 40 members in a year.
Wow.
40 members due to the pandemic. You add to that the component of racial tension, the messaging that's going out, the political messaging, and the political culture. It can take anyone out
Yes.
emotionally. Emotionally, it can just take anyone out. So I think when you are leading at the forefront, because everything rises and falls on leadership, and as leaders, I believe that we are called to live higher. That means that yes, we feel our emotions, but we do that, and then we come back to the drawing board with logic, and we look and we see what drives my decisions, what drives the vision and the mission that I'm working towards. And it has to be values. It has to be values. I am a values driven person. That is why I keep my leadership statement in front of me, because it reminds me that these are the values from which I operate. These are the values from which I make decisions. And if I stray away from that, then not only am I living inauthentically, but I'm really at risk for making some major decisions that can cost
Yeah.
me later on, because I've moved away from the values. And so in this culture, coming, through 2020 and to the present, we have to recognize that everyone has a story. I believe in the power of stories. And the reason I believe in the power of stories is because I have a story. And my story breaks stereotypes, it breaks
Yes.
boxes, it breaks ideas that people may hold. And I just believe that stories hold value, and we have to give people space and permission to say your story matters. Now,
Right.
stories matter, but they also should not override what's right and what's wrong.
Going back to being values driven.
Going back to being values driven. Exactly. And so I tend to take that approach and I bring that into my work. And I think it helps a lot of leaders who we can really get caught up in the emotionalism of what's happening in the culture. And I've been guilty of it. I'll tell you right now, growing up in a Black family, growing up in a Black community, growing up in spaces where back in the 90s, I was in Black Lives Matters like marches, not even
Yeah.
realizing that that's what it was. I had
Yeah.
a father figure who was very well known in the community. He was very pro-black, him and his wife, and they organized a lot of community events. And he kind of took me under their wing, and so everything they did, I was part of it as a kid.
Right.
And so I remember the cries for freedom, the cries for justice. I saw what injustices happen in low income communities. I made it through the crack epidemic here in New York City, which hit low income, predominantly African American and Hispanic communities. I lived
Yeah.
in these communities. So I have seen some of the injustice, some of the systemic things that have happened. So looking at that and remembering that, I also realized that today, with the knowledge that there are injustices that happen, there are unfair things, there are places that need to be revitalized and reimagined. How do we do that without creating other forms of oppression? How do we do
Yeah.
that without creating more divisiveness? How do we
Right.
do that in the midst of people who are dealing with racial trauma? And, like, I'll give you a good example. I was when we were coming out of the George Floyd situation, there was a lot of talk about racial trauma. Now, for
Yes.
me, I'm a white woman. I live to this day, I still live in a predominantly black community. I've raised my children here. The church that I attended for over 15 years was predominantly black. It probably was pretty much all black. And so I'm in these spaces. My mentees, the people that I do life with, the people who I'm close with, not because I sought them out, but because this is the
Yeah.
environment that I'm in.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And so I'm realizing now with images like George Floyd, images like Tamir Rice,
Hmm.
images of these different stories that just kept showing up in the media, that created a message that black and brown skin had no value, that there was a dehumanization attached to them. Someone like me who's living in these spaces, I was a trigger for people's racial trauma,
Yeah.
even
Yeah.
if I didn't mean to be. The same way that as a woman, when I experienced a sexual assault, because I'm a sexual assault and rape survivor, so knowing that, I know that going into certain environments where it's male dominated, or if I have to pass through a heavily male populated environment, there's a high chance I'm going to be triggered because of my past traumatic events. And
Right.
so, taking all of these different things into consideration, I know that I had to do the work on me to say that even though this may be truth, I need to still show up being values driven. I need to still show up letting love drive, my behavior, my interactions, and also not letting that kind of silenced me, because there was a time
Yeah.
where I felt like, okay, you know, I don't really know if this is the time that I should be speaking. And then now we're in a culture where the resounding message that I hear is white women are the problem. Oh, these white women tears, like we can't listen to them. And
Right.
I'm hearing a dehumanization coming from that angle. And I'm like,
Yeah.
well, that's not very different than what I heard when they said that these five young black men in Central Park supposedly raped this white woman, and now they're calling them thugs and animals and all of this. They
Right.
were dehumanizing
Right.
these young men. And that
Yeah.
became the dehumanizing language for a particular group of people. And guess what? On both ends, it is not of God. It is not
Yeah.
Christ like. It does not represent the kingdom. But because of the anger, because of the pain, because of this, and some people have their own personal stories of injustices.
Sure.
And so these things get resurfaced to the top. And now, in this cry for justice, in this cry for freedom, I'm going along with what seems to make sense at the moment, and it
Yeah.
may not align with the word of God. And so there's a conflict happening. And we are in a crisis where values are tested. And the truth is, most people, we don't even know our values because we don't really take the time to think about them. And when we don't know our values, we get caught up in the emotionalism of even very relevant and very real problems.
So you recognizing the value of story and recognizing people have traumas of many sorts, recognizing that we also need to be values driven so that we are not led by our emotions and all of these things, and looking at these things from these perspectives, how do you then equip those who are in the midst of, I don't know how to do this, and I don't know, like, how do I do this in the midst of all this stuff? I've got division here, division there. I've got rules coming in from the government about this, and I've got all this stuff going on, especially in education, all of those things. How do you help them? What's the message? Like, we know we're coming from a kingdom lens, a kingdom perspective. How do you flow, and how do you help them to walk through that process? What are some of those keys, and what are you experiencing from engaging in that way, whether it's training or consulting in those spaces?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I know that some of the most highly recognized work that I've seen really come out of the pandemic and just this whole social climate has been going back to the vision and the mission statement. So when we go back as a group collaboratively and we get curious about how is this vision and this mission something that we are working towards, what are our strengths, when we begin to look, see, I'm a visionary, so like even with my organization Look Up and Beyond, it's about looking up and beyond where we are currently, and it's
Yeah.
about being forward minded, it's about being vision driven and having a purpose beyond this moment here. And so I bring that into the work because I find that when we are forward focused, when we can think beyond ourselves, when we can have a vision and a mission that impacts the greater good of a group of people or
Right.
society, we tend to become less selfish. We tend to become less selfish. Now, I don't know if folks would agree with me, but I see that we are navigating an epidemic of selfishness. At the end of the day, everything is about me, how I feel, what I think. And yes, we all again have experiences, we have stories that are valid, they contribute to the lens from which we see the world, but they're not the gospel. So just because I've experienced great trauma from
Right.
a particular group of people, it doesn't make it gospel that I can lump people into that. I mean, imagine, and I'll share this as my personal story. I
Yeah.
was abused by Black Southerners who were influences in the church, who were
Right.
people that were respected. And then by the time I got saved and went into my first church home where God planted me, it was a Black church where
Right.
women who looked like my step grandmother actually attended. Now imagine I had let that bitterness really, really take over me. I would
Right.
have missed the plans that God had for me.
Yes.
I would have missed. And some of those church mothers that triggered me initially, that reminded me of my step grandmother, became some of the most impactful women in my life. The mothers that prayed over me, my children, the ones that poured wisdom into me. I mean, I would have
Yes.
missed out on incredibly rich opportunities because I didn't heal from that particular trauma in my past.
Yeah. So I guess this is what I'm curious about, because these traumas are personal, but then from a corporate or organizational perspective, how do they, like, because they could be like, well, listen, we're going to be focused on this vision and you need a therapist. Like, how do
Yep.
they navigate the spaces of like, real personal traumas that are impacting their environment and yet still maintain visionary focus? Is it because they're focused on the vision of the future that all of a sudden people are focused on that, and so therefore these traumas aren't like showing up daily? I would think not. I would think that that, especially in this day and time, in an increasing measure with mental health epidemics and all these things, that they're having to find new ways or new structures or new supportive systems or
Mhm.
whatever to even be able to successfully stay focused on the big picture and forward in the midst of all those things too.
One of the things that I always always stress is that our personal lives impact our professional lives.
Right.
We cannot separate the two. The things that create triggers for us in our personal lives will create triggers for us in our personal lives. And so,
Yes.
one of the ways that I really believe that we can begin to create a culture where we can even get curious about these things and really have these conversations that may be very difficult to have is by personal development, creating a culture of personal growth and development. Most companies and organizations don't really have a culture of personal growth where that's encouraged. You may have a staff training once a year, you may have a
Right.
professional development day every couple of months, but to create a culture of personal growth is to create a culture where it is encouraged to read 10 pages of a good book today. It is encouraged to listen to a podcast that's going to challenge you to really look at your core values. It is about bringing in someone who can help navigate some of these complex conversations so that you can use them as stepping stones to move towards that vision. See, conflict is nothing more than a gift. Conflict is nothing more than an opportunity to learn and to grow about each other. And a lot of times people attack the person versus attacking the actual issue. In order to have these very complex conversations, we all need to be on our own journey of personal growth, because what
Right.
happens is we become clear on what our values are. And if I'm a value driven person, then guess what? Then I'm going to see you as a value driven person. And that really highlights our strengths. And I'm of the belief that as humans, as part of the human experience, although we may have different cultural experience, we may have different stories, at the root of the human experience, we share the same things. And
Yeah.
those things should take precedence over some of the other things. That can
Do
only
you think
happen when we
do
value
you,
each other.
so you had said something earlier. You said conflict is a gift. Do you think that organizations, companies, whatever the context is, educational systems, corporations, or whatever, that they should create spaces to navigate those conflicts and stories? Is that helpful from that perspective on the way to focusing on, unity around a bigger picture?
I think it's touchy. It depends on the organization, right? And the culture of the organization. I mean, if you're working at a mechanic shop, it may not
Right.
hold much relevance depending on but if you are in the education market, or you are in workforce development and you're really actively engaging with people, and you have to navigate different personalities, and I think it's helpful. I think it's helpful to create spaces. Now, again, if you are someone who's never really had to think about topics like this,
Right.
it's going to be terrifying and almost impossible. And the truth is, a lot of people, and then I'll say it very real, a lot of white people never really thought about race until the George Floyd situation, because white people generally don't talk about race, from my observation, as much as people of color or black people talk about race, because they have different experiences. Now, that is a very generalized statement and it's not true for everyone. But again, as a white woman from the outside looking in, who saw the culture of white people on my social media, the culture of people, my black friends and different, colleagues, the conversations were very different,
Yeah.
very different. And it was
Yeah.
very eye opening, where you can see that a lot of white people never really thought about issues of race to that degree.
And so that's why it was interesting to me kind of paying attention to the landscape in 2020 when companies were trying to figure out what do we do, what do we do, what do we do here, what do we do internally, and some of them came to conclusions of creating these like workshops or these programs that were creating an environment that had these conversations up. And there were people who, like you said, were like, I've never had to have these conversations, and now I'm at work and I'm having to have these conversations, and I'm kind of feeling some kind of way about why I got to come to work. and have these conversations. And depending on, the you had talked about white women tears earlier.
Hmm.
But I remember like that Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, was becoming, which I did read because there were so many people talking about it. So I was like, let me read this book. And I read it and I was like, okay, there's some truth and there's some good stuff in this book, but there's a whole lot of stuff that this is not a kingdom approach to, because like it's rooted in shame, it's rooted in condemnation. It's not coming from this like healthy place. This is my
Right.
opinion in the matter. But then there was some corporate programs like built upon this. So I
Hmm.
could see why it would create like something that has a good intent of creating a gift of conflict that leads to something that's helpful. If it's rooted in something that creates an atmosphere of shame, condemnation, or what have you, for something that's perhaps even beyond, that either you're not aware of or has nothing to do with you, but has something to do with
Right.
maybe generations before you, that it doesn't help us. So so it's something that I really do, even though I don't navigate corporate spaces a lot these days. It's something that I really do think about because a lot of people are navigating these spaces and in the educational system and all of these things. And it's like, there's got to be kingdom solution ways of creating atmospheres that allow that level of unity with vision to come forward. And I'm
Hmm.
not sure. I don't know who's doing it well. And I don't know. I'm on like a little bit of an exploration. Like what are the keys to doing it well and who's doing it well?
Well, I think you won't hear who's doing it well because it's not going to really highlight what's happening in the culture right
Oh,
now.
snap. Wait, you just laid a whole word out. Snap. You
Well,
just said
if you
something.
think about it though, right? We are in a
You just
culture
said
right
something.
now where if you're not pushing CRT, if you're not pushing white fragility, if you're not pushing these ideologies, who again I believe, and this is my personal opinion, I believe that they start with very well intentioned
Yes.
work,
Yep.
very passionate, very meaningful work to say there's a problem, we got to fix it. The
Yes.
challenge is that you have truths muddled with untruth. And for
Yeah.
people who don't know the difference between the two, you get caught up in that. But you kind of sense like this isn't really right. This doesn't really feel good. It's really not creating a bridge. I feel like it's making the gap wider. Um, it's very, very evident because you have these new ideologies coming out into culture, and we've seen it get worse and not better. And
Sure.
so are these ideologies working? No, because they're rooted in falsehoods. Yes, there are some truths threaded into them.
Yes.
And that's what
Yes.
makes them very appealing. And again, if you are a person who loves justice and you believe in being a voice for the voiceless and standing up for those, who are mistreated, that passion is going to be directed in that way. The challenge is that we really have to take a step back and we have to say, like you said, does this align with kingdom truths? Now, I'll be very honest, I was a very white liberal, because I really felt like I've seen the injustices. I've seen it with my own eyes. I understand what Black people are talking about when they talk about these issues. And I realized that even in my desire to support these causes, that I was being problematic because some things did not align with the word of God. And
Yeah.
before I am a white woman, I am a Christian. I am a
Mhm.
follower of Jesus. And if it's something that does not align with Jesus's laws, then I am out of line. And so when I
Yeah.
began to take a step back and not allow my emotions to stir me to put the black dots on the social media image and to,
Right.
walk around with my Black Lives Matters t-shirt, anybody would know that the sentiment of that is truth. Anybody would know that. But what I realize is that you can't separate the sentiment at this point from the organization. And the organization does not align with my values as a follower of Jesus. And I had to really accept that and say, you know what? I need to separate myself from this here. And I go back to values because at the end of the day, despite our cultural differences, the different stories that we carry, that we live, when we are in a values driven environment, we know that we value each other. I value your story. It may not make sense to me, but I value the courage that you have to share it. I
Yeah.
value the experience you bring. We may not see eye to eye, but life is colorful and life is complex, and we're going to have different things. And so we need to create space for that. And I don't think jumping onto the bandwagon of these new cultural phenomenons of DEI is the answer. I just don't. I think they're
Yeah.
more problematic than they are helping us.
I totally get what you're saying. It's my my hope, because you said so. I'm still stuck on what you said when you're like, well, the ones that aren't doing well, the ones who are doing well, when you have good examples, that's not what's
It
highlighted.
won't be.
Because if the enemy's coming to create, wants to create division, confusion, etc., there's always opposition. There's always others who are there's a lot at stake to maintain a perspective of division,
That's
right?
right.
And so it's almost like, that's why I'm like, I'm just believing for like an underground network of kingdom focused people on these topics, that there's a platform for conversation of practices, of things that are working, because quite honestly, people will flourish. It doesn't matter whether they believe in Jesus or not. And like his ways,
That's
like
right.
people will still
That's
flourish.
right.
And so if there's those coming around, so that people who have a heart for this thing don't feel like their only option is to hop on board of things that are a mixed bag, but there's almost a whole other dynamic created of a kingdom lens solution around these things, that then if maybe the media doesn't want to create highlights of it, at least there will be pockets and community and collaboration that's sharing these things, so that it gets further propagated in other spheres of influence. That's my
Mhm.
prayer. That's my prayer.
I love that. I love that.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing. I think the fact that these are conversations that you're in the midst of, that you're paying attention to and also actively engaging in, is really great. And I love that you have the gift of experiences. They weren't great
Mhm.
experiences, many of them, but you have the gift of the healing on the other side of traumas that can form, and have empathy for how you're moving forward and how you communicate in the places and spaces that you're in. And that's a gift. And that's a gift for, from your story. That Romans 8 and 28, baby.
Mhm.
That Romans
Romans,
8 and 28.
yeah. So yeah, so during the pandemic, when this whole George Floyd thing was unfolding, this was around the time that I was really working in the youth market. So I was going to a lot of colleges, was doing high school stuff, working with youth and professionals who work with youth. And I remember as things became more intense culturally, that I was being turned away quite often from college
Yeah.
campuses. And with this whole movement of DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, what I was told was, at this time, we're looking for speakers of color. We're looking for Black speakers who we think would relate more to our students. And
Right.
I didn't really think anything of it. I'm like, okay, I do understand the importance of representation. Like, even to this day, I believe that it is
Yeah.
important. Um, then it continued, and then I began to see the trend, and I'm like, okay, now this is becoming problematic because I really believe very strongly that the bias against my skin color was really creating a loss for their students, because
Right.
I know how to work with students of color. I don't need
Yeah.
to be a Black person to bring principles and strategies and values. And because of my cultural experiences, I also knew that I can connect with certain
Right.
demographics within the student market. And,
Right.
it really began to make it very clear to me that when we start jumping on this bandwagon of these blanket statements and these ideologies, that we're actually doing more harm than good. Now, I do believe that these were very well-meaning people, who said, okay, I want the best for my students. But when you really take off the layers and you really begin to unpack that, and I don't care if it's towards me or anybody of any race,
Right.
when you look at when you take the layers off and you remove it, what's happening is we're making a decision based on race and not the value that the person can bring based
Right.
on their experiences, their expertise, their cultural upbringing. And so I really began to pray about this and say, um, how do I, number one, I knew that I needed to really trust God to open up doors and opportunities for me, number one,
Right.
so that I wouldn't get bitter and resentful. Because I have friends who are doing extremely well in that market. And I know that many of the opportunities they got was because of the timing. Like it was like, okay, you're, a black male, we're looking for black male speakers. You're a black
Right.
female, we're looking for, and I personally don't have a problem with that. I don't in general. Where I think it becomes problematic if that's the only way that we're operating, if that's the
Right.
only way that we're approaching this, looking for speakers and looking to hire people. And I just think it's wrong on either end. And so it
Yeah.
began to make,
It's not a holistic
it's
solution.
not a holistic solution. And that's
Yeah.
really where the values came in for me, being a value
Yeah.
driven person, because I believe as a leader that we need to be driven by our values, and values are always rooted in love. It's about loving people. That means I have to love people who I don't agree with. I have to love people who have different life experiences than me, who have different ideologies than me. But I need to value them as a person and I need to love them despite those things. And that's not
Yeah.
easy for most people to do.
Yes.
It's not. And
Yes.
especially if people don't really love themselves.
Yeah. That's real talk. You know, you shared before we hopped on, like before we hit record, you had shared, and you actually alluded to this in our conversation. You had said, I keep my values right in front of me all the time so I can remind myself, even in the midst of maybe a little bit of a frustration around the season and like being rejected on these aspects, or even before all of this went down and just like walking this out and wanting to steward, the work that you're called to. I would love it if you would actually share that, like share what you're looking at every day
Oh,
to
yeah.
remind yourself of this work.
This is my leadership statement that I created. I actually use this as a model in my coaching programs as well when I'm working with high achievers and purpose driven leaders. And mine states, I am driven by faith and purpose in all I do, striving daily to live authentically with integrity and wholeness. I use empathy, compassion, and love to create environments where people can show up as they are, grow, heal, and thrive no matter the adversity they face.
That's good. That's a good thing to have in front of you every day.
It is. It really keeps me anchored. It really keeps me
Yeah.
anchored. And it reminds me, like I said, like, I mean, a lot of this stuff really comes natural to you when you're in it, when this is like, this is my belief, this is who I
Right.
am. But it's good to just
Yes.
visually see it sometimes. Just
Yes.
have that reminder. You're having a hard day. Like you said, even in business, we face rejection for whatever reason. It doesn't even have to be anything
Yes.
related to race or gender or anything. Just be
That's
no,
right.
just no, no, no. And you're just reminded that at the end of the day, I'm just here to serve. That's it. I'm just here to serve. At the end of the day, it really goes back to, and this is, I really, really thank you for even having the courage to have this conversation and for the invitation for me, not just to share my story, but to really just have this dialogue around this very sensitive topic. It's not something
Yeah.
that we can unpack within an hour, 90 minutes.
That's right.
There's just so many elements to it. But I really believe that if anyone takes anything away from this, I really, really, really encourage each and every person to visit their values. What are your core values? What are your core values? Because our core values determine our behavior.
Yeah.
And leadership is about valuing people. And when we value people, we love them. Values are the glue that hold people together. That's why when I talk about vision and mission and going to something that is beyond where we are today in the work that I
Right.
do, that has to be driven by values, that
Yes.
enduring belief upon which I act upon, which we act upon. And, those things are sustainable in the long term. They are
Yeah.
able to override the complexities and the crises of life. Those values are
Yeah.
enduring.
That's right. That's right. The truth with a capital T.
Love that.
I love it. Well, I appreciate you so much sharing your story, coming here. And like you said, it's not something that can be unpacked in an hour, but I still feel like that even in this hour, there's many moments and many things that people can take and ponder on, in their own thought. I mean, that's what this is all about, is really just sparking thought, sparking conversation, having people sit with God around stuff in their own context, how we really navigate all this stuff with a kingdom lens. And so I love it. Thank you for sharing. How do people get connected with you if they want to learn more about your business and the work you're doing? Where do they go?
Well, one of the best places to go is lookupandbeyond.com. You can also shoot me an email at Jessica at lookupandbeyond. I'm also on LinkedIn and Facebook. I'm revitalizing and redoing my social media because that was hacked recently, which just served
Oh
as
man.
confirmation that I'm on the right track. Because listen, when you're out here loving people, not everybody's loving that you're loving people.
This is the truth. Thank you so much, Jessica. I
Thank
appreciate
you,
you.
Shae. This has been awesome.